Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on philosophy, and specifically Chinese philosophy and the 100 Schools, 100 Sages golden age of Chinese thought. And here we have a cat for now, and I may turn the camera if the cat deserts the post. I'm sitting on the gate here of the light and the dark. So, you'd like to think, with humanity, that times of peace and prosperity are good for systems of thought, but unfortunately, human thought definitely follows certain patterns where, in India, Greece, and China, you oftentimes have power vacuums where fighting and a bunch of systems crumbling makes people question the ways of things, and then there is free thinking about how to, often framed in terms of, as it is in China, how do we get back to the ways of things or the true ways of what? As you are having civilization shaken and then restirred into a new mix, and then you have, when power is consolidated, as Marge says to Homer, I don't care who's consolidating their power, that the new system oftentimes stands up for newer systems of thought and then uses that to share a bunch of truth and meaning and all of that. This is the history of art, science, philosophy, and religion. Very much. So we find this very much in the 100 Schools, 100 Sages period, which is also the Warring States period of China. So the Warring States period of China is also known as the Golden Age of Chinese thought. As the states war, there are philosophers such as Confucius, who technically comes just before that. There are philosophers, specifically Lao Tzu and Confucius, the first and foremost Taoist and the first and foremost Confucian. Confucius is, believe it or not. And then they are just before the Warring States period of China. And then as China collapses into a further Warring States period, people are reading Lao Tzu and Confucius and trying to come up with what becomes Confucianism, Taoism, and many schools of thought. And then when the dust settles, the Han, during the Han Dynasty, the great ancient formative period of China and Chinese history, they patronize first and foremost Confucianism and Confucius, who was somewhat cut back by the legalists, speaking of infighting amongst the cats. Will they lick or will they fight? They're trying to get more into the sunlight. That in Warring States China, first and foremost, Confucius was supported, but also secondarily Lao Tzu and Taoism, although that remained a bit controversial and spawned the Yellow Turban rebellions a bit in the latter Han. And so Taoism was always somewhat secondary to primary Confucius and Confucianism in Han China. This is basically the story of all that, which is an intro talk like the Yin Yang and the Wade Giles Pinyin System talks, as good intro talks on Chinese philosophy, with bonus cats. So, essentially, like in Greece and in India and Egypt and other periods of modern thought, European and otherwise, Europe modernized as they were blowing the heck up out of each other with the Chinese gunpowder in fancier and fancier tubes. So with all of that evolving against each other, one of my favorite things to mention is the Dutch invented drill fighting the Spanish. They had a lot of illiterate peasants. They had to teach them how to use a new fancier tube where you had to do something and fiddle with it in 2 or 3 steps. So the hut to one and then cock, okay, ready, aim. Yelling that out for everybody all at once is to teach a bunch of illiterate people how to fire fancier and fancier gun tubes. So with all of that, Europe was kind of fighting itself as it came up in the world. And that is, of course, sort of the Western civilization we all know. Hooray! You know, again, Gandhi says, it'd all be a good idea. Civilization all over the world, of course. So, as with the burden of all of that. So, speaking silly ways, in Lao Tzu and Confucius' China, there were great problems that then fell into the Warring States period, from around 500 to around 220 BCE, rounding and off. As many, just like in Athens, you hear Plato talking all about, many come and go, many rulers and leaders, and each call themselves the mandate of heaven, that they themselves have the mandate and the way of the heavens. Now, what is the mandate of the heavens? There it is. It is time for tacos and tortas and other foods for construction outside, and for the high school students and a bunch of people. that on my street, yes, that does tell you it's 11:30, actually. La Cucaracha and awesomeness. So, and that's surprisingly in a lot of my videos, because it's every weekday. It's pretty much there at 11:30. So the high school kids and then also construction folks can get some stuff. So with all of that, in back to China, not California's. What are we talking about? Stole the place, fair and square. Is with warring states and, of course, power grabs and everything coming and going, people want the heavens or the ways or the gods or the spirits to speak for someone. In ancient cosmology, of course, and then even modern plenty times, you find kings all the way up to Louis XVI saying the heavens speak for me, and then if you are no longer spoken for by the nobles or the king or the houses, you have charges. You are charged by the king with a certain office, which is how I carry this scepter and I am of the king, doing what he says. There is a lot about speech and speech being order in ancient thought. There's very much the king and the orders speak for you. And if the king and the orders continue to speak downward through the angels or the spirits and the gods for you across human cultures, then you are spoken for and affirmed. And then that is very metaphorically and psychologally what being empowered and having office is. So the mandate of heaven in China is that the heavens speak for, and this is still polytheism with decently somewhat, kind of father, gods, and God and the thing, is that you have polytheism. And then in human history, you find in China and India, the safe thing to say here is that China and India remain polytheistic and get a bit of monotheistic in ways, and then the Abrahamic traditions, they still have angels. They remain polytheistic, interestingly enough. They keep having genie and angels and saints, but they also have kind of almost bodhisattvas of Buddhism, but they also have a central monotheistic, there are no other gods, God, which is very much Judaism, and then Abrahamic religions onward, that taking and being cultural and all of that. So polytheism being somewhat monotheistic is actually the world over. China and India, they definitely keep the polytheism a lot, and then that actually is, of course, look over the world's cultures and see lots of levels of spirits, gods, beings, and then ruled over more with empire, with central, often male figures. So you find that in China and in India and lots of things, and how more polytheistic, monotheistic is kind of some of the difference there, is what I am telling you. That is obviously rounding off the edges on everything like heck, as I did the dates. Obviously, there's all sorts of diversity of this, and I am just trying to speak of all human culture as inclusively, and then talk about the differences between India, China, and the Abrahamic, say, cultures. So with all of these, and these are very major cultures, again, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, these are the India, Greece, China, large cultures and spawning of large cultures in the world, and in world history a lot, as well as humanity being all too human. Just gave the Nietzsche talk. One of several. So philosophy of the ancient world very much is about how do I get in accord with the community, and how do I get in accord with myself, and how do I put myself square in line with what I should be and what the community should be, and all of that. Get your ducks in a row. I've already had the Indian talks for East Asian philosophy. You hopefully have already gone over the Indian talks, and get your ducks in a row is something I say a lot as an American expression. Well, don't that beat the devil around the stump, children? So with all that, up to the French Revolution in the late 1700s even, for a bunch of white folk, Louis XVI is certainly saying gods in the Catholic Church, through the Catholic Church, speak for me, and that's very power and authority and impresses the peasantry and all sorts of folks. So the king getting spoken for by God officially through the Catholic Church for the French is pretty dang well important, up through the 1700s, and that's not that many great-grandparents laid backwards. So, which they find unpleasant, or don't. So China was settled as early as, to back up here a bit, as 5000 BCE, if not more. That gets political. People fight over ancient dates a lot. I definitely just say it does get political, and I do not care. Tommy Lee Jones, The Fugitive, and scene. The next 2,500 years, when the origins of Chinese culture were laid down, is called the Period of Jade, when the legendary Red Emperor, Shenlong, and Yellow Emperor, Xian Yuan, the X is pronounced HS a little bit, were said to have invented the basics of culture, including rites and rituals, Li, hunting, fishing, and agriculture. Now, Li, in English, Li today, and I think actually the Wade Giles Pinion does not change that. Li, And of course, it could be capitalized to make it nice. It's not capitalized in Chinese, of course, or not, nor German, of course. It would always be capital as a noun. Right, ritual, education, culture is a very important word in Chinese philosophy. Very much as they're talking about it, well, culture, which also means education, which also means religion, just the ways we do, the ways of things, is not just Tao, the ways of things, but Li, which is and again, I am not the language guy, but that is a word which I do at least know because I teach basics of Chinese philosophy. That then stands for a lot of these thinkers, the ways of humanity, whether they're trying to be countercultural or cultural, like the Confucians are saying, go get educated, and the Taoists say the way of things is really being a bit hippie and back into nature rather than just being cultivated, educated. So as they are going back and forth with the two major camps of Chinese thought about culture, about rites and rituals, there is a great deal of, well, these are the ways of the human ways of things. Should we not, or should we live like birds and beasts, other cultures or not? Which is very ancient Athens in the kicked back and forth between Persia and Egypt, monotheism, polytheism, lots of stuff. And saying, well, what of all of this do we believe? Do we practice? Well, we have Li, we have culture, we have the rights, we have the education, the stuff that is culture, tradition. And so, of course, even though probably there could be many different origins of hunting and fishing, it is possible, very much, I would say, that human origins are from Africa, and lots of hunting, fishing, baskets, practices may very well have originated in Africa with humanity, or very much, of course, with all of this in areas of interest that are not mine directly. I always try to melt humanity into one big melting pot, plenty, and still feel that is the human brainstem and brain and mind and body all together for the last 100,000 years at least. Of course, the Chinese think they invented agriculture with the ancient sage kings. Guess what? That's every culture. Our ancient Vikings invented, this is the dude, this Nord, invented fishing. Well, of course, perhaps all that's African, and the Chinese and the Vikings do not know that their ancient bearded dude invented fishing and hunting, of course. But you would find similar stories, of course, in human origin tales, long having forgotten where in migrating all around, and only developing writing and mathematics recently to record a whole lot and keep it straight. You would then have, oh, hey, this sage king is actually related to who we're saying the guy who invented hunting is. And what do you know before that? Agriculturists. Anthropologists do shrug and say, it's hard to know, before it's written down. That's definitely one of the things in grad school I mentioned a lot that I got. If it's not explicitly written down, I openly speculate about all these things and love teaching and opening up issues. But technically, if you're establishing anything, nailing it down, before people use the word Li in print, what the heck does it mean? You don't know, So what do oral cultures here say in China before it's written down? You and I and strict historians do not know, who are being strict with their britches. So in one passage of the Zhuangzi, which I do love reading passages of the Zhuangzi, and I've actually already got all my videos about a bunch of Taoism and Chinese thought already. I am filling in here now the videos about Confucius, and which is very wonderful, beautiful stuff, an amazing philosophy for the world. In a passage of Zhuangzi that I also read in other contexts, Zhuangzi the skeptic and the Taoist, my favorite of ancient Chinese thinkers, he says, one ancient sage was saying to the other, I have heard Confucius say, and the Taoists love, in the Zhuangzi especially text, mocking Confucius like he knows he's kind of he's a dummy. He's a jackass. That Confucius say that the sage does not work at anything. This makes Confucius sound weirdly like a Taoist and not like Confucius. Does not pursue profit, does not dodge harm, does not enjoy being sought after, does not enjoy the way, says nothing yet says something yet says nothing, and wanders beyond the dust and grime. Perhaps the British garage, pure garage. Confucius himself regarded these as wild and flippant words, though I believe they describe the workings of the mysterious way. What do you think of them? Chang Wu Tzu, Master Chang Wu, said even the Yellow Emperor would be confused if he heard such words. So how would you expect Confucius to understand them? Meaning, Confucius here is talking like a Taoist. He doesn't understand what he's talking about. Let me teach you some basic Taoism, is what this Taoist master is saying to a younger, foolish, stupid guy. He's like, Confucius doesn't know what he's talking about. He's talking like a Taoist. He doesn't get it. Let me explain to you how Confucius doesn't get it. And then he says, let's wander beyond the dust and grime together with I'm going to speak some reckless words. I want you to listen to them recklessly. How will that be? And then he goes on to teach a bunch of kind of Taoistic perspective in twists and turns. So which, again, I have enough up already on Taoism. Please watch the talks on Taoism after this. The word li, again, culture or something like tradition, but meaning also education, study, lots of things all together with simple words, as you find cultures doing, and then specialize more and more as they go along, and have further and further specialized practices. The word li, which is used in Chinese thought to mean not only devotional ritual, but also tradition and culture, much like Dharma in Buddhism and equated with li by later Neo-Confucians. Cosmic, much like cosmic Dharma, is related to the word for jade, as jade and items in jade vessels were given as offerings to the ancestors, gods, and spirits. And yes, speaking of the animated spirits, the word jing means reverence, which is proper not only for the gods, rulers, and parents, but for the ideal self, community, and the cosmos. Following the period of jade was the Longshan period from around 2600 BCE to 2100. I am just rounding off the dates because I'm not being the very precise historian. That's not our point here. The point here. This is the Longshan period, is the time of the sage kings Yao and Shun. In one passage of the Analects of Confucius, he says anyone can become a Yao or a Shun. Sun Tzu, not the Sun Tzu the strategist, but Sun Tzu, the third Neo-Confucian, also a legalist, which we'll talk about here, and Yish. He also says anyone, and he's a very prickly pear and very cynical about humanity, thinks we're all a bunch of wolf girl jerks. Again, she's sexual, she's violent, she's wolf girl. He says anyone, and he thinks we're all wolf girl, plenty Freudian style. He's like, anyone can become a Yao or a Shun. Anyone can become the greatest of sage emperors. Anyone. Nobody does, because we're all a bunch of worthless jerks, is what Sun Tzu is arguing. Is that he says, Confucius says that, arguing that anybody can, but as Sun Tzu says, Sun Tzu, which I'm just sort of faking tiny bit at the beginning, and then often I don't even know if that is making an impact or not, and I wasn't taught to listen to such sounds as a kid, of course, is that Sun Tzu is talking about how, as he says with a wonderful metaphor, anybody could walk to the end of the earth, but nobody has done it, even though everybody has 2 feet, which implies you could always walk farther, kid. Like, anybody could be more perfect. Anybody could become a Yao or a Shun just because there haven't been since ancient times. That doesn't mean you couldn't be next week. Just means you got to walk a lot farther than a bunch of these jerks, is what I'm saying. With your 2 feet. Everybody's given, is what he's saying. These are also people who are going to talk about people with their feet cut off. So, yeah. Confucius, the Taoists, and others speak of the mandate of heaven, the Tianming, and the way, Tao, of heaven, Tian Dao, but not much about the Lord of heaven as much. That is noticed by scholars. It's not that they say there is no central God stuff. Philosophy, it is both talking about truth and argument and all of these things and arguing about things, and then you often are and aren't mentioning the gods and the spirits so much. That is something you also see across culture. It isn't that people are being irreverent. In fact, these thinkers do say, but there are spirits or something. That they are thinking as much as they can, speculating about things and saying, well, whether or not this or that is, and that oftentimes does get you in hot water because you are questioning the ways of things and if there isn't or is the ways that we say there is. And you do that as best you can, of course, in all these ways. In India, Greece, China, and many other places, we can see that first many tribes and their gods were drawn into polytheistic systems, and then increasingly it becomes in ways monotheistic or entirely so. We can, and that is not me judging one way or not, and actually things are diverse and can go all sorts of directions. Of course, they're not just unidirectional some sort of way, but this has been often said to be something like human beings amassing larger and larger empires, and the effects of all of that, as well as everything you do and don't believe, as far as I know. So what you do find is many different gods with many different things. I do often mention, and Nietzsche, I'm doing videos about Nietzsche now. Nietzsche very much says, polytheism very much more says everything is a warring family of gods. It's not a peaceful empire with super dad, but you increasingly find a warring family with a bunch of squabbling of different interests and powers that be turns into super dad, all is good, and just a simple perspective. Without judging it one way or the other, since I'm doing the Nietzsche talks, Nietzsche is weirdly like Confucius in ways, but not so much in this way. Nietzsche does say, well, if we're smart today and we're looking around, things are very polytheistic and that there's a lot of warring powers that be in gods. And he is not saying, and therefore he's the monotheist or the polytheist. Nietzsche does say God is dead and you and I have killed him, knowing that that is traditional Christian belief about Jesus, and also knowing that he means there's so many gods now. As Nietzsche says, everything in the mind wants to be God at one time or other. This is all dangerous philosophy, and why some of these guys in China and Germany would be, keel-hauled, as it were. And you can look that up. I'm not going to describe it. So, ancient maritime punishments for those who don't just go over the side in the manacles. So, if you're slightly breathing funny, I imagine. So with all of this glory, technology, and thought, of course, and systems of gods and God and and sciences, etc., you can see a lot of similar human patterns in China, where you find something like philosophical monism then talking about the abstract mandate or way or truth or being. And that is something, no matter what you believe, that then people can do a lot of philosophy and talk about truth being, whether or not there are gods, spirits, God, science, etc. Which is how I draw this stuff together as history of philosophy and thought, of course. And again, I do assume all these cultures and people have minds. I love to show people the brilliant ideas that are recorded because they do show you how human the mind has been all over the world. And that is good for people to get in simple ways. So when we talk about, let's say, the laws of nature, whether or not it's Newton or Einstein, post-Newton or theory, again, it is talking about are there laws that are there or not, and you can have similar sorts of backs and forths. And theory is actually a godlike vision of something, which is like a theophany, theory, and the roots of it. I know the roots of the medieval words a bit. I'm not the languages guy, but I do know that's theo in the theory for a reason. That's because Greek ideias and theories are more godlike and polytheistic than modern talk of ideas, ideias, or theories, or God visions. Of course, they're more polytheistic Greeks. They think it's visions of God and fire, and that's what the words describe. And then argue with yourself whether or not we understand it how, actually. I would say we just choose not to really talk so much about whatever, as much as now I understand my visions aren't made of fire. Do you? Where's the pH test on that? So we just sort of use the words, and it's not like proving the ideas are alive or not. But all of this, of course, is where I love to go off as a history of religion philosophy guy. You have a lot of the polytheism, monotheism all mixed around in here. It's kind of amazing. But what you find, returning here from my rant about human cultural context to explain how this is all very human and not, and plenty and all of that, and its own culture and not being just human, like everyone perfectly, or equally, exactly, the Zhou dynasty, the old, ancient, revered empire that kept a lot of what is eastern China decently together, it's very much the eastern coast along the water of China, which was ancient China, which spread further westward, that they spoke of the Lord of Heaven, and when the Zhou overthrew the earlier Shang in 1029 BCE, 1,000 years before Jesus, that they supported the idea of the mandate of heaven, and they put out literature and edicts basically saying, and I'm sure songs, saying that they are the mandate of heaven and that the heavens specifically speak for them in order to consolidate their power, Marge. So the heavens speak for this king and this emperor and this empire. Now, Confucius and the Taoists in the Warring States period, though, they don't speak much of the Lord of Heaven, but are speaking a lot about the mandate and the way of heaven, and they are doing thinking that then is going to be used to legitimate the Han. That the Han are in the line with the ways of things. Why? Science, philosophy, religion. Because they are doing Confucianism and then also Taoism, which supports then, and I always mention, as science and philosophy and religion support and don't support empire, I do take the view of Hume. I've recently done a video on the Scot, and the only Scottish philosopher I know, sadly. No more artists, again, and thinkers than the classic philosopher. But Hume says, religion is a pivot for standing up to or being conforming to power, although he doesn't use that post-60s kind of language. And yeah, religion, philosophy, thought, all of this stuff does and doesn't support empire, is really the wider view, and especially in postmodern times, we can all cynically laugh at how science, religion, art, and politics have supported the Medicis and not, and supported power and not, in West and the rest, and everyone. So, with that, of course, Confucianism and Taoism are going to critique power, say, what is power, man, and then help support the state, is ultimately what this whole thing I'm showing you is, whether or not you're into conservative culture or progressive counterculture. Plenty. All sorts of ways. So they are actually, of course, questioning the old systems, forming new systems, and then becoming the new systems, as one can expect in cultures. Also, as we see in India, what is at first only for the royalty and the ruling class gradually becomes popular and common. As you can see in Egypt, there are big pyramids, and then there's tiny pyramids a little bit later all around it, which is anybody wealthy enough to make a tiny pyramid, and then that's popular enough you can do that without everybody freaking out. It is very similar where the way of things, the mandate of heaven, was something only for justifying the mostly the emperor's way of things, and people could talk the ways they want to, all over the place. But it increasingly becomes something openly said where you are trying to be in accord with the Tao as a fisher person, as a fisher, and it's like, well, who the heck cares whether you're in the way of the heavens? Who cares about your horoscope? Well, what was horoscopes for the king becomes horoscopes for the common person once the practices trickle down, unlike Reaganomics, I have to joke, from the left. But with all of that, again, the Tao says you cannot turn things to the left or the right. That does appear to be our economy. Perhaps that's ancient China. I don't know. It seems to have grown just as much. So with all of this, we have the 100 Schools period, which is the golden age of philosophy. Of ancient China. The spring and autumn period from 770 to 476 BCE then turns into the period when the you have the Zhou dynasty from 1029 to basically is crumbling into 476 BCE through the what is known as the spring and autumn period. Spring, autumn, turning, falling, etc. One of the 6 Confucian classics that became the text of the Chinese Confucian educational system and bureaucracy was the Spring and Summer Record, which is, of course, speaking of times as they are pre-falling apart, quite in the title. It's a period when Confucius and Lao Tzu lived. So they're not actually in the zoo, but they're trying to get back to the zoo in the crumbly times that are turning ever more cookie crumbly. It's quite a fortune. And fate. A little bit fatalistic. But then again, we're doing history, so we have to be. Mencius and Sun Tzu, the 2 great Confucians after Confucius, and Shuang Tzu, the guy I quoted, the great Taoist after Lao Tzu, lived in the 100 Schools or Warring States period, from 476 onward to the 200s. At the time when Confucius and Taoism were forming along with and competing with other schools and following other sages. The 100 Schools period ended with the brief Qin dynasty, which was from 221 to 206. They did not hold power for long, about 15 years, it seems. And then the Han dynasty went for 400 after that, from 206 to 220, both sides of the 0 mark. Not the whole 0 year, apparently, but something like whatever the heck 0 would or couldn't have been, even if they couldn't have symbolized it at the time or not in this or that culture. That you have something about 400 years around here. And that is basically the China that the Qin unified, but then didn't hold on to as the Han did. So basically the Qin unified China, that's where we get the name China from, and then actually the Han took over after 15 years and kept it for 400 years, 200 before and 200 after the year 0. So the golden age of Chinese thought leads into the eventual Han, and then that's when Confucianism and Taoism get nailed down. Now, there were the 100 schools, which is a good round way of saying. The Chinese often say there's 10,000 things. That's 100 times 100. 100 schools, that's 10 times 10. More than 10. There were lots of schools and sages. The 4 most popular and famous were Confucianism, Taoism, Moism, and legalism. I'm going to mention legalism right here. We're going to talk about legalism as much as I will. And then I've already given many talks on Taoism. A lot. Hopefully all that's palatable. And then I am going to be giving more talks right now on Confucianism and Moism as this progresses, not today, but I will get to. And that will be filling in not only the 4 most popular and famous philosophies of the Warring States period, which is Confucianism, Taoism, both kept by the Han, as well as the 2 not kept by the Han, Moism and legalism. The Qin were into legalism. Sun Tzu, the 3rd Confucian, is both sort of a legalist and a Confucian, oddly enough. That we're going to be getting into much greater detail if you watch my Taoist videos as well as the Confucian and Moist videos I'm going to make. We're going to be getting into 3 of these 4 in detail. And we're going to talk about Moism, even though the Han did not support it, nor did the Qin, But legalism we're going to cover with the Qin right here, and then we'll be done with legalism here, and then we'll talk more about Confucianism. I've already talked a lot about Taoism. You should watch that after this. And then a lot about Moism. At least one video, decently, possibly two. There's a lot of good stuff to say about Moism, and I actually am not the expert, but there's a lot of folks who actually know a lot about Moism, and it's pretty amazing. We learn more and more, decade by decade, and I mean, that's what we can read in English, but also, I mean, Chinese scholars have been cranking through more and more each year on all of this, as they would, and have for, well, 2,000 plus years. Form of time, children. Spit. The word China comes from the Qin. The Qin were patrons of legalism, and Emperor Qin pronounced Confucius a subversive danger to the state. So actually that Sun Tzu, the Confucian, is sort of a Confucian and lumped into that canon, but also sounds like a legalist, is sort of saving Sun Tzu and his record from the more and Mencius and Confucius' works are more popular, saving him kind of as a Confucian for the Confucians, away as opposed to getting him dumped from the record as a legalist. Confucian books, including the Analects, Mencius and Sun Tzu, oddly enough, were sometimes burned. It is not clear how much, though. Again, it was said they were just X'd out completely. There's evidence of that. It also is how much was Confucius completely prohibited at the time. Well, it became for the Han, the Qin were so evil and need to be overthrown that they would destroy all the Confucius, and we're going to save it. Well, that's what the Han say. So obviously, as I say that, Chinese scholars and modern scholars would be like, yeah, well, that's what the Han say, is that Confucius was tried to get chased out of everything and burned completely. Legalists were strict, though, as we're going to talk about right here. So it's not completely impossible either way, plenty. Somewhere in the middle, probably, a bunch. There is evidence Confucianism was persecuted like heck. Was it ever completely banned? The Han definitely say that it is. And in fact, again, I'm sure there's plenty of evidence on lots. I have heard this is controversial by later Confucian scholars who do walk back claims of earlier, like scholarship often does in many fields, when it's honest and good. So the legend developed that Confucianism and the text survived hidden in a well, just in one well, which again, that's rather legendary, isn't it? Legalism was started by Shang Yang, who lived from 390 to 338 BCE, and then in Qin times, championed by Han Fei, from 280 to 233 BCE. Central to legalism was the idea that law, fa, should be strict and in the interest of the state and the ruler who ensures protection and continuation of the state, a position much like Hobbes, the later British political philosopher, takes in his book Leviathan, that king is the law, the Oakland PD are the law, they can't commit murder effectively, that is qualified immunity in a sense. I'm not the legal scholar here and I back away. If the cops are the law, then I am the law. That yes, they get to kill you. It is never murder. If this is the way, and I'm not going to say that's the way, nor do I want it to be, and I'm not insisting. Let's not have it. So, yeah, with all that, if the cops or the king is the law, murder is never the case that they gave them, nor Snoop Lion could. Because, yeah, it's, no matter what you or he may be smoking, is that obviously the king is the law. So for Hobbes, that's where the tiger gets his name from the comic, actually, as the brute, cynic realist compared to Calvin, the fiery preacher, as the boy, actually, is the weird intellectual joke there. I am to understand, and I'm pretty dang sure is correct, that basically you have Hobbes says, no, the king gets to kill you. It's never against the law. And Shang Yang is very much that. No, king is the law. Brute punishment, chop off the hand or the foot, which again is better than just killing everyone. And it leaves quite an example, unfortunately, to wander around and hobble. And so, yeah, basically Shang Yang is like, yeah, brute punishment. People are only self-interested. We have to use brute punishments to regulate things. People will only respond if there are great threats as well as great rewards, and what the British call later the stick and ye old carrot. However one applies these things. The legalists rejected alliance to family and the aristocracy in favor of unity, with strong emphasis on punishment as the effective tool of the ruler, a bit draconian, as they call it, much later in Europe. They believed in the evolution of society beyond the ways of the past and towards a new disciplined future, much like the Soviet Union a bit, but without the communal property of the Moists, who the legalists despised plenty. Share everything, let's all share everything plenty, as the Moist sort of strange kind of proto-communist would say, is not very legalist, nor what either the Qin nor the Han like. Well, some Han rulers employed legalism to rule and patronized legalist scholars, and that is probably why Sun Tzu ends up on both sides somewhat in the record. The Han did not overall employ the authoritarianism of the legalists, likely because the Han were trying to win over the people at a prosperous time. The Qin had used this brutality to solidify what is today Eastern China, what was then China. But at the time after that, and more of China than had ever been before. But as the Han take it over, they know they have to walk back the harshness, even if the harshness was quite utilitarian and instrumental. So as they do that, they say, oh, but we're into love and marriage and Confucius and the horse and the carriage, and also the Taoism secondarily in the countryside don't have so many yellow turban peasant rebellions later. So they equally did not like the communalism of the Moists, though. Let's all be kind of in the kibbutz, though, who believe that war should be abolished, and like in Plato's ideal republic, which Moza is very like Plato, weirdly, all property and family shared in common. That makes Confucius like Aristotle, because he's like, balance here, public-private, is versus Plato and Moza, who are like everything public, commune, kibbutz, and that is the ideal community. Kind of a bit Marx, full Marx on all of that. So we will study Moism in the weeks to come, as well as the School of Names. I say weeks to come for the class, whether or not I record this otherwise tomorrow. Also called the Logicians. I got those videos up. Who are also sort of called the Sophists, sadly. See the talks on that for Greece. We will spend more time with Confucianism and Taoism, though again, because those are the folks. The Han choose to supporting education, scholarship, and the arts with Confucianism and secondarily Taoism. So Confucius and the Taoists propose somewhat different solutions to the problem of self and society. Now, I do like the Hegel lens of you have something like objective and subjective and something like cultural and countercultural. And you do see that. And it is interesting that Hegel did not think of Chinese thought at all. He gives it nothing, and then he gives India and Islam a sort of zero held on to a position, didn't really develop. Unlike Hegel says Greece is stage 2, Germany is stage 3 of human culture. Which, yeah, and German Lutheranism, again, final answer, a form of culture. The correct answer is Mormons. That Confucius and the Taoists are very cultural, countercultural, in a way Hegel would have liked, and he was completely unaware of, it would seem, while as a German aware more of India and doesn't give them much credit or progress. That Confucius very much says study and is very much kind of Republican dad. The Taoists are a bit more hippie, go off into nature, lose yourself, find yourself, even though all of these people lived in the city and in the countryside, both. It is often proposed that Confucius is more, and it has been portrayed in China very much, and was in those times a bit, as not necessarily this versus that religion exclusively, but that Confucian, it is a bit more like philosophy, where you can be more one and then also the other in China with these schools and religions, which is why sometimes people do like the word religion, sometimes don't. I just think it is that people are brutal and human everywhere. They're a bit looser with the exclusivity in religion in India and China, but that doesn't mean A, B, or C about it entirely. You understand. So given all enough people and history is what I mean. So the Taoists believe that going off into nature, forgetting embedded understandings and rejecting typical human ways, which you find all of sorts in Christian mysticism and culture, counterculture, for hundreds and thousands of years, was best for cultivating the individual, while Confucius believed that the city, morality, and study were best for cultivating human virtues. So while Confucius and the Taoists were both questioners of individual desires and judgment, the Confucians believe we should turn to civilization and cultivation to realize our true nature, and the Taoists believe we should turn away from civilization and back to simplicity and the natural to realize our own nature. Again, I joke, I try to show off my post-hippie male virility with hair, books, statues, and plants. And cats, let's not forget about dude snoozing through the lecture. Yes. But yeah, basically, of course, how should you be all awesome and civilized and amazing? Should you turn towards the modern day or back to kind of the natural past? And oddly enough, turn back to super nature, back before civilization is kind of hippie and progressive, weirdly. Countercultural, though, and for the Taoists, not really progressive to anything, as opposed to everything moves and progresses, of course. So you have here very much a sort of more dogmatic Confucianism, and then the countercultural Taoists, as I already quoted, mocking that, being like, guy doesn't know what he's talking about, stuffed shirt. So you find that back and forth in China, those back and forths between objective, subjective truth, culture, counterculture, you can find all over civilizations. I like the Hegel here. Hegel doesn't even get there to China in a plane, train, or otherwise. Exchange of texts. Which is sad, because again, you can see the stuff in Greece they talk about, and India, that Hegel sees a bit in India, but not much. All over the world and in cultures, which is why going on about Confucianism and then on about Taoism in the next many lectures is interesting to hear, no matter who you are. And whether or not this is properly subtitled. So, much love on that. That is the talk on the 100 Schools the Warring States period, which is also the 100 Schools, the 100 Sages, the 100 Philosophies, the 100 Philosophers period, in the ways the simple words work, and cover many different things with simple words, which is also the golden age of ancient Chinese thought, as a simple intro talk to anything about Chinese thinking. So, much happiness, and I will continue and follow this up on more talks on Confucianism and Moism, which will join the talks I have already done extensively on Chinese Taoism and Chinese Buddhism, including Chan, which then is known to us as Zen. So much happiness, much love, many of the values, familial nature and otherwise, and I will see you if I ever see you.